Hi everyone, and welcome to our panel on perspectives from future leaders. I think we spent the last couple of days listening to perspectives of current leaders within the industry, so I think it's perhaps fitting to conclude this week's AGM with a panel on perspectives from our future leaders. My name's Kieran McGonigal. I'm Assistant General Counsel at ISDA, and I'm delighted to be joined by my fellow panelists and participants within the ISDA Future Leaders in Derivatives programme. To my right, Tamika Bent, counsel at Linklaters. To her left, Kendall Park, lawyer, international legal at Westpac. To my immediate left, Victoria White, senior associate at Allen & Overy. And on the end, John Nance, product strategy at Axoni. Before we begin, I thought it probably makes sense to spend a little bit of time just giving you an overview of the Future Leaders in Derivatives programme. So the Future Leaders in Derivatives programme, or IFLD, started last year, and really the objective of the IFLD was to develop a professional development programme that identified future leaders within the derivatives industry and provided them with a platform like this to share with us their views on issues of strategic importance to ISDA and our members. Another core component of the programme was to promote diversity. And I think we've been successful in doing that through the programme, and I'd be interested to hear the perspectives of participants as we get into the Q&A. In terms of the deliverables or the substance of the programme itself, there were really three key components, or there are three key components. Networking and soft skills training, I think in common with most professional development programmes. But another really substantive element of the programme has been the technical aspect. And you'll have seen tomorrow, and you'll have heard Scott mention in his opening remarks this morning that the IFLD have today published two papers, one talking about technology and innovation, setting out a roadmap for the implementation of new technology within the derivatives market, and a second paper on sustainability-linked derivatives, really just a primer as to that market, and really talking about how that market can be developed and grow into a robust market. I'd encourage anybody or everybody here today to look at the papers, to engage with the topics, and to engage with the participants. The contributors to each of the papers are named in the appendix, and I'm sure they'd be delighted to receive questions from each of you. And to deliver the papers, we split the IFLD into two distinct working groups. So one worked on the technology and innovation paper, the other worked on the ESG paper. And we'll talk a little bit again when we get into the Q&A about those papers, the objectives of the papers, what they cover, etc. So with that, let's move on to the Q&A. So panelists here today have each been identified by their respective firms as future leaders within the derivatives industry, and that's clearly a very impressive achievement, but also carries with it significant responsibility. So I'm interested to hear your perspectives as you begin the journey to the next phase of your career. Perhaps you could give us some sense of how you got here. What have your firms and support networks done well to support your development? And what obstacles have you faced, and how did you overcome these? And perhaps starting with Tamika.
Thank you, Kieran. It was absolutely a pleasure to be a part of ISDA's inaugural IFLD program. And in terms of my career, when I think about my career trajectory, I was born in Jamaica, so it was really, I had imagined being an attorney, but I never imagined that I'd have the varied experiences that I've had so far, which includes just learning a foreign language, studying in foreign countries, working for a leading international law firm like Linklaters, and participating in this particular program. And at times, it has felt pretty challenging. I'd say some of the obstacles included, perhaps sort of overcoming potential bias and potential discriminatory sort of behavior or conduct. But I have an amazing network at the law firm, and outside of the law firm. And my network is from various demographics. I have people within my network who have different race and gender and age, and who are in different industries. And from that network, I've been able to sort of find allies, people who really speak up for me in circumstances where I might not have been able to speak up for myself. I've found mentors, people who advise me at very critical points in my career, and also who function as a sounding board for substantive matters. I've also found sponsors, people who actually use their political capital to talk about me and to help me progress in my career. And I've developed very authentic and genuine relationships and friendships with people I currently work with and people I've worked with in the past. And I've done that through these micro moments of mutual self-disclosure, where I share a little bit about myself on a personal level, and they share a little bit about themselves on a personal level. And we realize that there are so many commonalities. And through that, we build a bond and we build trust. And I found that my allies, my mentors, my sponsors, with whom I have authentic relationships, have been really valuable and instrumental in my career path thus far. So, those are some of the things that have sort of helped me along the way.
Great, thank you. What really comes across here is the importance of support networks, allies, mentors, etc. So that's really interesting to hear. Kendall, from your perspective.
Thanks, Kieran, and hi, everybody. I think from my perspective, the greatest obstacle that I faced was when I was embarking on my career and actually getting a foot in the door. I finished my university degree in the wake of the global financial crisis, and it took a couple of years for that to really impact law firms. So I had this idea of this legal career that was, very traditional, summer interning and then becoming a graduate and working my way up through a law firm. And it just wasn't an option for me, pretty much, in Australia at the time. It was really fortunate for me that I was offered a role in an Australian bank and took a less traditional pathway of training in that bank. And I'm grateful for that opportunity, almost every day looking back at it, because a career in finance has meant that I have been able to work internationally. I've worked in Singapore, Sydney, now in London. I'm about to be admitted to the New York bar, and also the type of the work that we do in derivatives industry. It's at the frontier of financial services. So it kind of was an obstacle, or it appeared to be, but actually it was exactly what I needed.
Yeah, fantastic. Vicky, from your perspective.
Hi, yeah, I'm going to somewhat embarrassingly put my hand up and say I was my own obstacle. So I think I've been at A&O since the beginning of my career, did a 2-year training contract, including going to New York for 6 months, and then qualified into the derivatives team. And really, I think what's driven me forward has actually been the culture of trying to be the best, doing the best you can, really expecting really high outcomes. And for me, I think I sort of joined as a trainee, and it was a huge moment. I was really proud of it, and I sort of thought, okay, I've done it. I've done that now. And it was only as I progressed through my training contract that people said, but surely you want to go to New York to work. Surely you want to do this. Surely you want to do that. And it's really the culture, I think, that has helped me raise my own expectations at each step of the way. And that, I would say, combined with partners and senior associates who are willing to push you slightly beyond where you're comfortable, because you don't achieve when you're comfortable, and sometimes people like me need a tiny little shove to get out there.
Yeah, fantastic. And Sean?
Yeah, thanks for having me on this panel, and very delighted here to be in Madrid. Yes, I think when I started to think through this question, generally I think individuals are geared for success if they're in organizations that really mesh well with them and also focus on the growth of that person. For me, I found a lot of that in Axani when I first joined. One of the first things I noticed was the amount of autonomy that I was granted with knowing not a lot when I first had joined, and also then placed with lost a lot of responsibility to build out some pretty large-scale products. And so as a result, there's a large focus that I had to make on what do I need to know in order to make the right decisions. And out of necessity, that requires you to learn a lot, learn a tremendous amount about your industry, learn a tremendous amount about the technology, and then also establish a decision-making framework that allows you to build out those right decisions. I was very fortunate to have incredibly intelligent people that were very patient with me to try to help me learn that. A lot of it was our clients. So a lot of our clients were very patient to help us understand what are the different markets that we're entering into and how can our technology help us capitalize on that.
Great, thank you. The thing that sort of comes across to me in I think all of the responses is the importance of others in being an ally, promoting, pushing you if necessary. So I think that's probably an important takeaway, I think, for everybody here. The impact, I guess, that you can have on people here coming up. It can be really valuable, really profound, and can really help people to develop in their career. Kendall, you alluded to it earlier. We live in interesting times, and it feels like we have been living in interesting times for the past 10 years. And I think a lot of you and a lot of other participants within the program likely started your career around the time of the financial crisis. Not certainly the case for me. I remember my first day as a trainee lawyer was the day that Lehman's went bust, and I feel like that sort of has defined my career in some respects. But I think one of the interesting dynamics around that is that whereas I suppose if you began your career prior to that, this period of regulatory change that we've seen in the last 10 years may be seen as something of an exception, but perhaps for us and for others within the program, it's more business as usual. So how do you think entering the industry during that period of significant upheaval has influenced you, and what impact has it had on your career, and do you think it stands you in good stead for the next 10 years, Kendall?
Yeah, you're exactly right. I think the cohort that I was in started in the industry, just as I said, in the wake of the GFC, but also when the banks were grappling and firms were grappling with implementing G20 regulatory reforms. Initially, I thought that was another obstacle. I thought, how are we going to approach this? But actually, it meant that I was stepping into a bank where my voice was actually heard as the specialist in that area look to the lawyers and compliance and risk professionals to get guidance on the impact and assess how they were going to approach some pretty tricky regulatory change. Pardon me. I think we all went on the regulatory journey together. I think, gone are the days where if you're a derivatives professional, you're not able to sort of just focus on one specific aspect of a transaction. You need to be aware of the regulatory context in which you're operating in, whether it be VM, IM, pre, post-trade reporting, clearing, just to name a couple. So I think there's been a distinct shift in that way. In terms of the next 10 years, I think that the next group of leaders are uniquely placed to really drive their institutions to success. If you have a look at the past 10 years, we have learned we've come from a starting point, so we needed to learn sort of everything there was about derivatives, but then on top of that, we needed to learn the regulation, and in a quite high pressure environment. So I think the cohort that I'm in, we know how to operate under severe pressure, but also with considerable technical acumen. So I'm really excited to see, what the future holds. And I think that's why it's so important that we have programs like IFLD to promote that.
Great, thank you. Would anyone else like to come in on that?
I'll jump in to say I completely agree that my whole career to date has been defined by reacting to, new regulations which have been coming out. And that has been my business as usual. And I will say, as a lawyer, I think that's actually quite good. Like, I've really enjoyed having the challenge of new regulation to get up to speed with. And for me personally, it's allowed me to develop my practice, which has been quite heavily focused on margin implementation over the past 5 years. And it's been a great thing to get your teeth into as a more junior heading into sort of mid and senior, because you're sort of going through, in theory, the same process each year, but with new challenges and slight tweaks. And for me, I've really enjoyed working in that regulatory landscape. And I think as a lawyer, it gives you a lot of key skills that you just have to get up to speed with, not least, working with multiple different regimes and, the inevitable not quite match, even though we try our best to make them aligned. And I think it's been a really useful experience for me and people in my sort of intake to really get to know our clients on a personal basis, and as the regs are changing and as updates are coming through, to understand their business and very quickly have to get up to speed, as Kendall was saying, with the regulation, but also to know how exactly will this impact the risk team, the ops team, how does this translate for them? And I think it's been, I know it's not necessarily a popular view, but I feel quite privileged to have been able to do that and start from a position where everyone was starting from scratch. Everyone had the same opportunity to learn and get on with it. And I found it, certainly challenging and difficult and pressured at times, but a really good opportunity. And from the ESG perspective, I certainly think those skills continue if you sort of look through the alphabet soup of regulation coming up.
Absolutely. So,
I mean, I can jump in as well. I don't think that I would be practicing as a regulatory lawyer if I had started practicing earlier. I mean, I graduated in 2007, and I started at Allen & Overy, and they had a rotation program. And when I graduated, I was convinced that I was going to be a litigator. There is no way that you could have told me that I was not going to be a litigator. But Allen & Overy had a required rotation program, and so one of the departments that I rotated into was capital markets, and that was in 2008. And I sat in the office of one of the partners at the firm, and everything I read about on the front page of the New York Times or Wall Street Journal had something to do with the work that he was doing. Bayer, Lehman, Merrill Lynch, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley. Every time I walked into the office, we were talking about how clients were reacting to these various events in the financial crisis. And I found that really fascinating, actually. And that piqued my interest in capital markets. But it was the financial crisis, right? So I started in litigation. I spent 2 years in litigation and advocated to actually transition back to capital markets in 2011. And that was 1 year after Dodd-Frank was passed. And luckily for me, I actually very much liked research and analysis and interpretation and writing and advisory work. And so as part of the capital markets team, I did a lot of regulatory work. It was all of what I liked about litigation and none of the things that I didn't like. So that worked out really well because I did both transactional and regulatory work. I think over time, my practice has focused mostly on regulatory matters, but I would never have considered it if it hadn't been for the financial crisis. And I think for the next 10 years, or for the future, I mean, Dodd-Frank is still being implemented, right? The CFTC is probably well ahead of the SEC, but there's still new regulations to be implemented. There are new market entrants, and so there's perhaps an adaptation of certain regulations as well. So I think compliance will be at the top of the agenda for many financial institutions. And so I think the need for regulatory advice will continue to be pretty significant.
yeah, it's not going away anytime soon.
No.
John?
Yeah, so for me, I started, before I was at Exani, I was at JP Morgan Asset Management, and a lot of our projects were regulatory in nature. In some respects, I'm wondering why I'm cleaning up somebody else's mess, but in other respects, it also gives you, gave me a very good opportunity to ask a lot of poking questions to understand how the system works, because a lot of times regulation comes along and you need to, figure out all the different processes and systems that need to change in order to meet that change. In order to do that, you have to understand how the current system works. Of course, I think of everything from a technology angle naturally, and so one of the first things I noticed is that pretty much with every regulatory change, the technology change as well. And every organization makes the decision of whether you want to enhance your existing system or build a new system to replace your existing system, or as an add-on on top of your legacy infrastructure. And with every single project, everyone's making the decision over and over again. But one thing that's quite obvious is that when a regulation comes in, it really highlights how agile and flexible your existing systems are. And so from my perspective, it's a key opportunity to think, as I'm sitting in a seat now, like just trying to re-platform a lot of existing infrastructure, that it's incredibly important to build things with a long-term view to be very agile and flexible, because there will always be some crisis that comes, and you need to build infrastructure that will be ready for that. So it's an interesting perspective coming into a system that's in flux, and flux is BAU.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think there's probably two ways of looking at it. You could look at it as a market crisis that John wasn't responsible for, or as an opportunity to build something new. And I think that's the way that you all seem to be looking at it. Okay, so I mentioned at the outset that the IFLD today published 2 papers. So let's get into the substance of those. To develop the paper, as I mentioned, the group split into 2 working groups, and we have 2 representatives of each working group here today. So we'll start with the ESG paper. Vicky and Kendall are our representatives from that group. And as I mentioned, that paper focused on sustainability-linked derivatives. Vicky, could you perhaps give a brief overview of the paper, explain what you hope to achieve, and what are the key messages for the audience here today?
Sure. So very early on in the discussions that our working group had, we identified that sustainability-linked derivatives were likely to be a growth area, and an area that we thought our particular broad spectrum of participants could contribute to. And so our paper really is drafted with a view towards the anticipated growth of that market, and also with an eye specifically to providing a broad spectrum of practical guidance as far as possible. And we took inspiration from some of the existing ISDA guideline papers on the implementation of margin. And so I think I spoke to Kendall beforehand. We might split. We're very enthusiastic. We have a lot to say. So I might give a brief intro into sort of the substance, and Kendall will talk a bit about how we went about the process. So just in case anyone has been sitting under a rock for the whole rest of this AGM, an SLD is a transaction which either creates or embeds an ESG cash flow. They use key performance indicators in order to measure compliance of one or both counterparties with an ESG measure, and that affects the ultimate cash flow. ISDA already had published a couple of papers when we started looking into this. One looking into sort of regulatory classification, particularly in the US, EU, and UK. And the other was sort of a more practical guide to drafting KPIs and considerations surrounding them. And that paper really was looking to sort of increase liquidity and the safety and soundness of the market by educating people on the best approaches. And we really took inspiration from sort of that driver for our paper. And so, as I say, it's intended to sort of be a useful starting point, hopefully for anyone within an institution who either are or are thinking of entering into SLDs. So in terms of the substance, we obviously cover what is an SLD, why they're useful from the perspective of both parties. We then sort of, without duplicating the existing work of the reg paper, take a little look at the existing regulatory landscape. We also cast an eye forward to, as I mentioned earlier, the sort of avalanche of EU ESG-based regulation that we see on the horizon. And we sort of tackle head-on, I think, the sort of greenwashing risk to explain what concerns people sort of at a high level abstractly have, and what steps you can take if you're thinking about entering into SLDs to guard against this. And that really involves, from our perspective, making your KPIs as strong as possible. Leading on from that, our paper then looks to key documentary terms, and that sort of leads on to our discussion of KPIs in a lot of detail. and particularly a focus around verification and disclosure processes, which we thought were really important to give as practical a guide as possible as to how you can strengthen your SLDs. And finally, because we really wanted to cover the whole gamut, we also cover data management concerns. We also cover a little section on capital treatment, and really we've tried to be as broad as possible, covering practical concerns. So we also cover considerations of hedging. So from what I've listed, and I don't want to take too long, but you can see we really covered the broad spectrum. And so I did just want to say actually a really big thank you to lots of people at ISDA who helped us. And I certainly I'm not mentioning everyone, but Paniotis and Stevi, Olga, Bella, Peter. It was really invaluable to have your input because we had a strong view that we wanted to cover a broad spectrum. We did need a little bit of help along the way on where we should focus. So that's sort of substantively what we cover.
Yeah, thanks, Vicky. I echo those thanks. I am immensely proud of the paper that we've produced. We had a working group of folks in the IFLD ESG stream from across the world, so Sydney, Singapore, the States, London, and we were able to come together and produce something that I think that we're all really quite proud of. I think in terms of how we approached the paper, it was very much to piggyback on what Vicky's just said. It's very much focused on a practical and operational document that you can pick up and know exactly what are the things and the issues that you need to think about if you're looking to enter into SLDs. It is a start to finish overview of a trade life cycle. So overlaid with all of these issues that Vicky's touched on, we have a diagram at the start of the paper which outlines at which point in the trade life cycle you'd need to be considering these items. So, for example, we have pre-trade, trade execution, post-trade, and trade termination. If you take, touching on one of the things that Vicky's just mentioned on greenwashing, greenwashing in the paper, we state that it could be something that you should think about at the pre-trade, the trade execution, and to trade termination / post-trade arrangement, or rather position. So, for example, in the pre-trade, if you were looking and considering greenwashing risk, you'd be looking at items like how you're structuring your KPIs, whether they're robust, whether you've done sufficient due diligence on potential third-party verification agents. With the trade execution stage, greenwashing considerations would probably include things like considering whether you need to continue to run due diligence on those third-party verification agents, or indeed if there's a pay-away structure, whether you need to be, continuing to check whether the charity that you're paying away to, remains in good stead and appropriate for that trade. And at the tail end of the transaction, if the worst happens and it needs to be unwound, there's a question mark there from a greenwashing perspective as to whether there needs to be disclosures to the market to sort of acknowledge that perhaps some of the statements that were originally released celebrating that transaction may not be the most appropriate anymore. But as I said, I'm immensely proud of it. I hope that you all, enjoy it as much as you can enjoy a paper about sustainability-linked derivatives. But also for those of you who do have participants in the IFLD program, I'm sure that any of us would be delighted to talk in our relevant institutions more about it. We're all a very passionate group.
Great, thank you. That comes across. And as Vicky mentioned, ESG has been mentioned several times this week, I think in almost every panel. And perhaps those panels where it wasn't mentioned, they've spoken about technology and innovation, which was the subject of the second paper and the second working group that was tasked with looking at that topic. John and Tamika are resident representatives from that group. And on that paper, I think one of the really interesting things was the group decided that technology and innovation can be a rather abstract concept at times, but I think one of the really positive things that the group did was make the decision to take a really practical approach. So setting out a roadmap for senior people, senior representatives within the derivatives industry, and to really set out what needs to happen in order to, I suppose, take advantage of the promise of new technology. John, from your perspective, or perhaps you could give us an overview of the main takeaways from the paper and perhaps some insight into what areas or what types of technology the industry should be focusing on.
Yeah, so for our paper, we tried to look at kind of 5 to 10 years down the line. What are going to be some of the largest benefits of using such new technologies, and really focus on 2 different use cases. And for us, originally we came up with the idea by taking a look at what are the various technologies that we want to look into, and what are the different maturities of the technology. Some are a little further out than others. And maturity also means not only just technical maturity, but also level of adoption today and ability to gain adoption in the short term. And then also urgency of the issue. So there's some issues that are hurting firms now that could use could use a solution in the near term. So we focused on 2 topics that happen to be talked a lot about throughout the AGM, which is regulatory reporting and collateral management, and essentially pairing those 2 with it happened to be 2 different use cases of DLT, just different types of DLT. Regulatory reporting, we mainly looked at DLT in the context of data synchronization, whereas collateral management, we mainly looked at DLT in the context of the use of digital assets as collateral to enhance that process. So I'll touch a little bit on reporting, and then Tamika can go through a little bit on collateral. But on the reporting angle, one of the things that we're looking at is how do we improve data quality today? It doesn't require a lot of scanning through news articles to see the amount of firms that are struggling, to put it lightly, with providing high quality data to regulators consistently. And so, in the context of DLT, what that technology allows for is, at the most basic level, synchronizing 2 databases, and also providing a cryptographic guarantee that those 2 databases are in sync. And that's incredibly important for regulatory reporting, especially when you have different requirements like you need to reconcile with what you had just submitted, what you just sent to the regulator. That sort of process is already built into the technology itself. But there's also a number of other technologies that we also mentioned in it, because in order to synchronize, in order to really make use of that synchronization, the source of that data needs to be high quality as well. And so there we sort of mentioned a couple other, I guess you can call them technologies or different ways of thinking. Authoritative data stores, CDM, and the DRR are the 3 big ones that come to mind. So on ADS, the idea behind that is, it stands for authoritative data store. The idea behind that is it is a golden source for multiple, essentially all counterparties to rely on as the ultimate source of truth for trades and trade-like data. And it becomes a lot more powerful when a lot of firms build other processes on top of that ADS. So in the context of regulatory reporting, that's incredibly important, that if you're able to use the same system that you're using for cash flow calculations, maybe risk processes, analytics, as regulatory reporting, because you then embed a lot of scrutiny on making sure that data is high quality just for your own internal purposes, let alone for regulatory reporting. There's a lot of benefit. In order to really establish that, it's also incredibly important that every firm agrees on how that ADS stores and processes data. And so the industry effort in order to produce a standard way of processing data and representing data as a CDM, it's a prerequisite, we believe, to establishing a solid authoritative data stores. And the DRR, which was mentioned in yesterday's panel. So is doing the same thing that the CDM is doing on codifying trade processing to codifying regulatory rules. So there's a lot of different technologies that are embedded there that could solve the problem. That require a lot of industry focus on both the technology side, but a lot of other groups. On the collateral side of things, we started to explore the use of digital assets for collateral processing, and there the digital assets could mean native digital assets like Bitcoin, but it also could mean tokenized representations of existing assets, mainly for the benefit of instantaneous transfer, transparency in terms of lineage to track things like rehypothecation, and another few benefits. But Tamika, you want to tackle the rest of collateral management?
Sure. So we also created a roadmap in terms of the steps that we think the industry needs to take in order to be able to use digital assets as collateral in the next 5 or 10 years. So one of the first things we think should happen is that the industry with service providers should really collaborate to create DLT-based platforms that will allow for the transfer of digital assets. And we also believe sort of the next step is for the industry, all segments, to migrate to that platform, which I know can be very difficult for firms to really change the way their collateral management system is set up. But the idea there is that for it to work efficiently, all segments of the market, buy side, sell side, custodians, would actually need to be on the platform in order to be able to really make a significant difference. And then the other thing we considered is from a documentation perspective, it would be ideal if collateral documentation was digitized and adapted to these particular types of assets. And ISDA already has some framework for that. ISDA has ISDA Create and the clause library and CDM, and so there's already a foundation that the industry can use to digitize documentation. And there's also a working group on contractual standards for digital assets. So I think the first part of the working group is focused on the master agreement, but at some point the collateral documentation would also be adapted where required. And then, this is a global market, so we thought it would be important for international standard-setting bodies, national regulators to really enhance the framework for digital assets. They would be considered property interest that could be transferred by way of security interest. So perhaps in the US, there will need to be some consideration with respect to the UCC and how that functions for digital assets specifically. And then one of the other things we considered was just how to adapt that framework to the current margin rules. So for example, for UMR, for Reg IM, certain types of those assets that are eligible are specifically listed in the rules, right? So could digital assets actually be considered eligible assets for UMR purposes? For example, when you think about central bank digital currency, should that be analogous to cash, for example? So that was one thing that we thought should be considered. And then, why not think broadly, right, and boldly? Perhaps if this works really well in the derivative space, there are ways in which this could be leveraged for other asset classes. So perhaps for repos, perhaps for second lending. So I think we are also proud of the paper that we put together. We really tried to be bold in thinking about what the future might look like in terms of the use of digital assets for collateral exchange and settlement. And maybe in our lifetime, we'll see some of that come to fruition. We're hoping.
Absolutely. Great. So I mentioned at the beginning, one of the core objectives of the IFLD was to give future leaders a platform and to talk to the industry. So we're at AGM, we have 5 minutes left. You're speaking to an audience of senior individuals within the industry, all of whom I assume have some interest in promoting the next generation of leaders. what advice would you give them? What should they do to promote the next generation? John?
Yeah, I think, at least for myself and a lot of people that I speak to, that the next generation wants a dynamic place where they can learn, where they can grow a lot, and also have an impact on whether that's the impact on that company or an impact on their industry. So there's a couple different angles to that. One, the learning component I think is incredibly important, especially people who are young in their career. The number one thing they want to do is learn as much as humanly possible, which some of it is training and courses, but a lot of it is also the senior leaders with all the knowledge to be very patient and spend the time and invest in teaching the younger cohort how the system works. I think that's pretty critical. And then on impact, leaders that are receptive to change and feedback, and making sure that a lot of people within the organization know that, I think is pretty critical.
When I was thinking about this, I thought I'd keep it short and snappy. I think personally, and from people I've spoken to, one of the most effective things you can do if you want to encourage and promote future leaders is, once you have identified who those people are, let them know. Because they might not realize that we're all busy, we're all trying to do our best, but the difference it can make to step outside, take a moment and let someone know, we think you have real potential, you're doing a really good job, what can we do to support you, makes the world of difference. And the exact support that person might need will very likely depend on their background, their characteristics. But that first step in letting someone know, we appreciate you, we think you're really adding value and you have potential, makes all the difference.
I fully agree, Vicky. I was reflecting, and I think there's three things. The first thing is invest in your people. So put them forward for IFLD programs in the industry. Give them stretch assignments so they can show that they've got the capability for their next role when that time comes. The second item is raise their profile. So if I look at my current manager, she's done an amazing job of making sure that within the bank I receive formal and informal feedback, both via her, also directly, and additionally has ensured that I'm involved in industry associations and my face is out there. And then the last one, which I think is the most important, is feedback for them directly from you. It needs to be timely. Obviously, it needs to be accurate, but you can't grow unless you receive both positive, but often, let's face it, developmental feedback. That's the way that you're going to become your best self.
Thank you. I think we're out of time. I should conclude by saying that this program isn't intended to be a one-time thing. We are intending to run the program again next year. So for anybody who's interested, or for anybody who thinks that there's a person within the organisation that would be really well suited to this, we're working through the nominations process for the next cohorts. You'll hear more about that in due course. The papers that we spoke about, as I mentioned, they were published today. They're available on the ISDA website. It would be great to get your feedback. And that, I think, is it. So thank you very much to my panellists. Thank you very much to all of the IFLD participants. Thank you very much to the ISDA IFLD committee who have run and managed the programme. And thank you all very much for listening. Thank you.